Hello and welcome to Modern Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And it's our Oscarbait episode. Well, if Oscar bait isn't an offensive term for the film The Shape of Water, which we are reviewing, in which a woman falls in love with a fishman. And then we'll be asking our top quality Oscar bait question, when will Spider-Man finally win an Oscar? But before all of that golden glitzy material, Alistair, what have you been consuming lately?
I've been watching a new BBC detective show called Collateral. It's quite high profile. It's probably, I guess, one of the big BBC shows of this year. Detective drama, which the BBC has done lots of and is very well known for. This is, I guess, significant because of the quality of the cast they've got. It stars Kerry Mulligan in supporting roles. We've got John Sim, Billy Piper, Hayley Squires, who people may remember from I, Daniel Blake. Yeah, and it's just a really good, really tense, sort of police procedural murder mystery that the BBC does really well and in a really stylish way. Sort of set in South London. There's quite a lot of well-known sort of South London landmarks like the DLR or London Bridge or London Bridge Station feature in it. What's also, I think, interesting is it's kind of adopted the slightly Luther-esque take on a detective drama, which is that most detective dramas revolve around the big question of who did the murder. This one, like Luther, who is revealed quite early on, but the big mystery is why. So I quite like that's quite a different take on the murder mystery, so it's interesting.
Why rather than how? Is how usually quite obvious?
Yeah, you're right, actually. There are quite a lot of murder mysteries that do also go around how. For example, the locked room subgenre of murder mysteries.
In the realm of BBC detective dramas, I was thinking about Jonathan Creek, the most elaborate how-done-it of all.
Yeah, exactly. Jonathan Creek is very much focused on the how, and the who to a lesser extent. But yeah, in this one, I'm going to avoid spoilers, but this isn't a spoiler because it's basically the first 5 minutes. The how is obvious. A bike courier is shot outside an apartment block. Yeah, it's quite obvious. Yeah, it's just...
Yeah.
And then the who is revealed quite early on. I won't say any about that because there are some interesting twists in the first episode about that. Yeah, so it's not like they're kind of investigating the people around the victim to find out who did it. The police don't know who did it, but you as the audience do. The big question, which I've seen 2 out of the 4 episodes, so halfway through, is we don't really know why. They're sort of getting pieces of the puzzle, but yeah, there's a big question hanging over that.
So it is one long case rather than a string of individual ones.
Yeah, it's one story told over 4-hour-long episodes. I don't know if they might do a second series, I guess, in which there'll be a new case. But yeah, it's kind of one big story. But yeah, obviously there's other bits that weave in and out. There's quite a lot of supporting characters. John Sim plays a sort of rising star of the Labour Party. Billy Piper plays his ex-wife. There's a plot line involving a priest who's gay and harbouring an illegal immigrant. There's the family of the murder victim. There's quite a lot of stuff about immigration in the show. The victim is the refugee, and there's lots of stuff going on around it, so there's lots of subplots and stuff, but obviously some of these subplots will become incredibly relevant to the main plot and the big question of why, but at this point, we're not really sure what direction it's going to go in.
Yeah, this isn't actually my thing, but I've been reading another large book by David Simon, the guy who created The Wire. This one is called Homicide, and was also turned into a TV show. Yeah. And this is him talking to homicide detectives about their job. And this might be more of something that applies more to like the killing streets of Baltimore. But his comment on why done it was basically, I find that most day-to-day detectives just investigating random killings in Baltimore never get that hung up on the why. It's always mostly just about where's the evidence, what did they shoot him with, who saw it, can we get them to confess?
Oh, well, that's interesting. I guess that's one of the many ways that real life is different to fiction. I mean, probably most murders are like, why? Well, money, drugs, revenge. I mean, fairly simple motivators.
Yeah, so it might just be apathy, maybe it's more of a concern in less gang-dominated situations, I don't know.
I mean, I don't know much about murder that isn't gleaned from TV and film-related murder, so I'm hardly an expert. I'm an expert in murder on TV, which is not the same thing. But I guess why is probably apparent in most murder cases.
Yeah.
What makes TV interesting is when they make mysteries out of things that are usually obvious. And I guess they make a deal out of the show that this is an unusual murder. It's not like the Kerry Mulligan character is supposed to be a kind of a jobbing murder detective. I assume that the majority of of the character's time that we don't see is her investigating fairly open and shut murders in South London. Obviously, like, if you're writing a work of fiction, you should focus on the most interesting part of a character's life, not necessarily their day-to-day. So I guess they make a big deal. This is like an unusual murder. Yeah, if I go into more little spoilers, but it's good. Watch it if you like, especially if you like BBC detective dramas. This is up there with some of the best. Anyway, so that's what I've been preoccupying myself with. Nick, what have you been up to recently?
Well, I started reading. Well, I resumed reading, really, The Boys, a comic series by Garth Ennis, who we have discussed on this podcast before in various contexts. He's the guy who created Preacher and is also quite well known for a large amount of work he's done on the Punisher character. But yeah, The Boys is a series about a group of operatives who have various military backgrounds, but they currently work for the CIA, whose job is basically to keep superheroes in line, because this is a universe where there are a lot of superheroes. So it's basically about military hard men killing superheroes for the most part. Yeah, Garth Ennis has always been fairly upfront about how he sometimes gets annoyed by superheroes' domination of comics and how he wishes there were more comics in like genres such as military and western and all the comics from the sort of comics for boys anthologies he read while growing up, and I'm sure other genres as well. I'm sure he'd be happy to say other genres that he doesn't like should also be allowed to exist alongside superheroes. So yeah, and this was in some ways the most, straight up manifestation of that, in that it's a comic book ran for 90 issues, I think, and it's entirely about these military hard men killing superheroes.
Sounds a bit like that third series of Heroes when the government gets involved and tries to put them all in prison.
Possibly a bit like that, except we're very much not on the superheroes' side in this case.
Right, oh, I see.
We're the protagonists are the boys, who are this sort of small CIA unit, and we're very much... But there's a bit of moral ambiguity thrown in there, but mostly the superheroes are, like, self-obsessed celebrities or people living weird Caligula's lifestyles, and generally we're meant to cheer or at least feel some degree of catharsis when the boys inevitably kick the shit out of them, or find out that even if some people like them, they're fundamentally bad.
It sounds like an interesting inversion of what we're used to from superhero stories, when superheroes are usually the good guys, apart from the odd one that goes bad. But yeah, this is very much the inversion of that.
Yeah, it's, as I say, it ran for 90 issues, which is quite a long time to get out of the lol that man kicked Captain America in the balls joke. But yeah, I started buying it a while ago, and then I eventually fell off, and then only to find that there was a Comixology sale where I could get like 4 volumes for a tenner or something, so I did decide to buy the rest of it. So now I've got all 12 books of this, and I've had them for about a year or something, maybe 2 or 3 years actually. So I thought I would actually read them, because it is one of the few remaining major long-form Garth Ennis comics I haven't read. Yeah, although it does get a bit, okay Garth, we get it, for the reasons I've sort of mentioned, it is quite good in the sort of, in order to, compensate for the fact that in some ways it's quite a simple premise, he's done quite a lot of world building around this, there's quite a lot of political intrigue and a lot of sort of very deep woven mystery about where the superheroes come from and what was created them and what their actual purpose is, apart from just getting drunk, being in the news and having sex with each other, and what the sort of shadowy motivations of some of the people on The Boys are. So yeah, it's, in many ways, the funny thing about The Boys is, even though it's one of the most simple, obviously cathartic premises in the world, it's actually become weirdly complicated. I think one of the reasons I fell off it in the first place is because I was reading the books about, 6 to 10 months apart when they came out, because, they were collecting these monthly comics, and I just sort of lost track of how this incredibly complicated conspiracy held together. So now that it's finished, and because it has eventually now finished, I'm going to go and read the whole thing.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, we've enjoyed covering Garth Ennis material on the podcast. So yeah, I'm always interested to read more of his stuff, because he is a good writer. And I don't know many comics writers, but he is one I like.
Oh, the art is actually by Derek Robertson as well. I think you have read at least one Garth Ennis, Derek Robertson comic, because they had a team behind Punisher Born.
Oh yeah, going right back towards the beginning of the podcast.
That was quite an early recommendation, yeah. So you can probably imagine what them doing sort of vaguely military-themed stuff is like, since you have read some of it.
Oh yeah, sounds very good. Yeah, especially if it's anything like The Punisher Born, which was, again, a good and interesting sort of military-based story with superheroes.
There's a bit more slapstick in The Boys, it does have a sense of humour, albeit sometimes quite a grim one, whereas The Punisher Born was, even by Garth Ennis' standards, very straightforwardly depressing.
First, this episode, we will be reviewing Guillermo del Toro's The Shape of Water, which has been nominated for 13 Oscars. Set in a government research lab in the 1960s, the film charts the unusual romance between Eliza, played by Sally Hawkins, and a humanoid water-based creature played by Doug Jones, and their plan to rescue this creature from the government. It's a strange and stylish film, but Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, I can't really argue with that description. It's a very sort of charming sort of fantasy fairy tale. As everyone says, it's a sort of very pleasant, swirly, feel-good experience. It leans very heavily on Sally Hawkins, who, to the best of my knowledge, is not mega well known. I don't pretend to watch, that many Oscarbait films outside of the ones we do for this podcast, but the only things I've seen Sally Hawkins in recently that I can remember are the two Paddington films. And in fairness, she was great in those films, so it's hard to dispute the point.
Yeah, Blue Jasmine was well received. I didn't see that. Happy Go Lucky is really good, which is, that's a sort of British, sort of rom-com, but, sort of rom-com light drama.
But yeah, a lot of it is just basically an extended character piece for Sally Hawkins as Eliza. Other characters get some stuff to do, some more than others, but Hawkins is pretty great, and that's, pretty impressive in itself, considering the lead character is mute, and, therefore she has to command this entire film, basically, without actually speaking, which is pretty impressive. It's an odd film which feels a bit like nothing else, and it feels like it's selling itself primarily on taking its sort of quite memorable primary one-line pitch. The whole woman falls in love with Fishman in this sort of sci-fi military fantasy facility setting, and doing a really great straight version of that, taking itself sort of fairly dead seriously. Certainly, there's very little tropey genre awareness in the, dialogue. There's no sort of, it's just like a movie. Although there is a bit of sort of, I don't know, the visuals are very knowingly Hollywoody, I think. It's very much referencing other similar films. But yeah, I did enjoy this a lot. It's hard not to like this, really, I think. It's very sweet.
Yeah, I think you're right. Sweet is the kind of best way to put it, in that it's got a very charming sort of love story at its core, and that's kind of the majority of the film. Yeah, I also really liked how it's quite a simple story. It's just a sort of straightforward love and escape story. Two people fall in love and then they sort of struggle to be together against a society that frowns on their love, or at least has other ideas. So quite a simple story, but it's very well told. Guillermo del Toro is a good director. He's made a lot of good films. So yeah, it's no surprise that he's told a very effective, good story here. Yeah, I mean, I just thought it was good. It was just really sweet. It kind of leaves you there and going that's nice.
Yeah, there were a couple of nice sort of sharp, cruel bits. There's enough sort of sense of genuine, oh shit, that was nasty, to at least let you get somewhat feel something other than just sitting there going, oh, the entire time. Which I did sort of appreciate. I don't know if that makes me a terrible human being, the fact that I just yearn for the sight of blood. But, yeah, a terrible human being, or possibly some sort of weird cinematic vampire. But yeah, I did enjoy the fact that Guillermo del Toro didn't just go, right, it's a love story set in a sci-fi setting, you know how this goes. There's a bit of sort of bits that really jar you out of that, at least a little, even if you do then sort of settle back into it again afterwards.
Yeah, I mean, there is a real sense of tension throughout the film, and Michael Shannon plays the primary villain, the person who captured the sort of water-based creature and is determined to be quite cruel to it. And he's very good at being sort of malevolent and quite unpleasant and quite violent at times. So yeah, this is a film that has some quite unpleasant scenes of violence and him torturing the creature that he's captured. So it's not all sweetness and roses, but how bad the Michael Shannon character is, and sort of how sort of oppressive the sort of circumstances between Eliza meeting the sea monster creature, kind of adds to the fact that their love is. It makes it kind of sweeter and nicer because their love is coming through against the odds. Because again, and they are in real risk of suffering because there's a quite oppressive bad guy who's after them.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Shannon is perhaps a bit, I don't know, straightforwardly evil as the villain. But then again, I think, to be honest, apart from Eliza, a lot of the characters are quite straightforward. I mean, she has a friend played by Richard Jenkins who's given a bit of extra shading, but a lot of the other characters are a bit sort of, here's the villain, loyal friend, spy, etc. But that is mostly because the focus is on Eliza herself. It's surprising that we don't actually get that much characterisation for the monster. It's there. It's, relatively visually appealing as monsters go. But it doesn't really get, characterisation. I don't really know what the monster wants beyond, the fact that it loves Eliza and presumably wants to not be tortured anymore. We don't really get much sense of it. It's very much the sort of unknowable monster presence, even though it's also the other half of our central love story.
Yeah, I mean, again, because it's quite a simple story, I don't know if we went more into the backstory of the creature, how it was captured, what its life was like before it ended up in the...
Oh yeah, it's not a criticism. I'm just saying that is clearly a choice that was made.
Yeah, exactly. It works well, and because the film is quite tight. One of the ways it is quite tight is that a lot of the characters are quite iconic. Like you say, there's the best friend, there's the guy who lives across the corridor that's helping her as well. There's a Russian spy in the American research base who is a sort of my enemy's enemy is my friend kind of role, in that he wants to capture the creature for himself, but above all, he doesn't want the American researchers to have it, and he doesn't want it to be killed, so he kind of gets co-opted into helping the main characters bust the creature out. It's all fairly straightforward, but it's done in a really sweet and entertaining way.
Well, yeah, I don't know. As we watch more and more films for this podcast, I do increasingly wonder if films trying to do incredibly complicated, epic storylines is, I don't know, I'm sure it can work if you've got a tight enough script and a good enough director. But it seems like a lot of films that really work and are really good seem to be when they've got something that's more sort of short story length, and therefore have time to do a bit more flourishes and establish a bit more world and do a bit more sort of big, exciting shots of things, rather than having to desperately rush through the storyline or just compress everything to the point that it barely makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right there. This shows why simple stories work really well, in that it doesn't feel rushed. There's plenty of space for the story to breathe and for you to get into it, because it's not too complicated. I've always thought that like a lot of the best adaptations are based on short stories or novellas, or at least short novels. Big novels don't make great films because you have to either cut loads or radically rewrite them. Things like Shawshank, based on a novella, it works really well. You know, we covered Arrival probably about this time last year when Arrival was up for Oscars, and yeah, Arrival based on a short story, it works really well. I've long thought that actually the obsession of turning popular novels into films doesn't actually work that well.
Then people will just increasingly come around to the opinion, possibly correctly to be honest, if you want to adapt an epic novel onto the screen and make it so you don't have to hack it to death, probably make a TV series.
Yeah.
But that seems to be the better option.
Yep, I'd agree with that.
So yeah, I mean, yeah, a lot of it is the beautiful simplicity of it. Weirdly, at times, the visual style reminded me a bit of a Zack Snyder film. You know, not necessarily meant as a criticism or anything. I know Zack Snyder's reputation has taken a bit of a pounding in this post his Superman-related films world, but if anything, it took me a bit back to Sucker Punch. It's very green. It's very sort of fake in a way. Not in a... Again, not really intended as a criticism, but I did get the feeling I was living inside a sort of artificial cinematic world. You know, it's maybe treading on our next segment a bit, I don't know. But it's very much a movie, you know. She lives above her cinema, her and her friend are enchanted by old movies. She walks through these sort of green facility corridors with, you know, huge pipes and sort of huge space around them, probably for no real reason other than so they can take dramatic shots of it. Everything's very sort of noisy and visually interesting. It's, yeah, I don't know, it felt very fake, whereas sometimes it doesn't work, and I didn't particularly like Sucker Punch, but, you know, yeah, I think here it did sort of add to the sense of the fantasy of it. I mean, it could also be the case that this is a rare example of a fantasy film getting Oscar buzz, because it's also a fantasy film that nods quite heavily to the magic of Hollywood. I hear they love that. They certainly liked it in La La Land.
Yeah, I think you're right that Hollywood loves films that lionize its own past. Yeah, and obviously this is set in the early 1960s, and the main characters live above a cinema and they watch a lot of sort of classic studio system era Hollywood films. So yeah, Hollywood's own history is very much a part of this film, which is something that Hollywood does tend to love. But also it's part of like this period setting. And I think one of the things I love the most about the film is how beautiful the period setting is. I mean, Guillermo del Toro really does like relish the details, I think, in films. Like in The Devil's Backbone, it's kind of the era of the Spanish Civil War is very painstakingly depicted, and even in Hellboy and things like that, you could just tell there's a lot of detail that's gone into thinking what everything looks like. Here, it's absolutely beautiful. It's like the costumes, the cars, the music, you know, the set design. Everything is just so beautifully evocative of that sort of late 1950s, early 1960s period, which is one of the reasons why it's so good, is it's just beautiful to look at and to listen to.
And possibly to avoid the standard accusation of sort of romanticising that era. If the forbidden love between Eliza and the fishman wasn't enough, there's also Richard Jenkins, her friend's character, who's struggling with being a gay man in this era and facing some prejudice and stuff. And, you know, just to remind us all that, you know, it wasn't all sunshine and roses, and bad things also happened.
Yeah, it's very good with acknowledging the problems of the past. There's obviously, there's homophobia directed towards Eliza's friend Giles, as you say. There's several scenes of racism when, you know, minor characters will act in a, you know, racist or misogynist way. It definitely shows what the values of that time was. And, you know, it's not all kind of, look at the past, weren't things quaint and lovely back then? It's not like that.
Everyone was free to run around and have sex with whatever fish they wanted. Yeah. The past. Free love, man. Free love. I also listened to the very good podcast from Overinvested about this. They also seem to like it quite a lot. They did comment that it's interesting that the fishman love interest, this is sort of, I guess I said this earlier, is somewhat objectified. You know, he is just this sort of physically hot presence to an extent. He's just kind of there playing this role to Eliza.
Yeah.
Which I guess you could turn into a point about portraying love interests in that, you know, the love interest is literally a thing that exists just to give the main character what they need, which I guess... Obviously, in this case, the lead character is a woman and the love interest is a man, as well as being a fish. And, yeah, obviously, in a lot of cases, the lead character is a man, the love interest is a woman, and not a fish. And therefore, it is less clear why this non-fish woman has basically no purpose beyond giving the main character what they need.
Yeah.
I don't know to what extent that point was in Guillermo del Toro's mind, but I thought it was a good point.
Yeah, no, it works well on that level. I like the fact that the kind of the basis of their relationship is that they both can't talk. In that Sally Hawkins' character is mute. One of the reasons why this is an amazing performance from Sally Hawkins is that she's so expressive and so captivating on screen without saying anything at any point. She's really good at just, you know, conveying all of her emotions without using words. But I like the fact that like they're the two people in the film who both can't speak but can communicate. So I think there's a point when she says, he's the only one who doesn't see me as broken, or he's the only one who doesn't see me as less, something along those lines.
Yeah.
I just thought it was really quite nice. And I think, again, it adds the kind of, the sweetness of it all. Yeah.
Yeah, the shape of water, the sweetness of it all.
Yeah, it is a very sweet film. Sweet, sweet water.
Yeah, conversely, that sounds disgusting.
Yeah.
Yeah, this has something crazy, like 13 Oscar nominations, you said?
Yeah, it's got the most nominations for any Oscar film this year. It's this year's film with the most nominations, I'm pretty sure. We might come to this in the next segment, but I think it's the fact that it's got such beautiful set design, costume design, music. It's nominated for a lot of technical awards as well as the top tier awards, sometimes referred to as the Big Six or the Big Eight.
Yeah. Yeah, it's basically it's a very easy film to like, was I guess going to be my point. It's not. I can see why a lot of people came away thinking when watched all the films, then sat down and thought, which film did I enjoy watching? Oh, The Shape of Water, that was nice. I can see why it's it's stuck with people and being rewarded. It is above all a very nice, pleasant film, despite being a bit over 2 hours. It doesn't feel like a drag at all. It just goes past in a nice, pleasant haze.
Yeah. If I had to criticize it, one thing I would say is that I think that the romance story does move quite quickly from it starts with them just hanging out and eating lunch together, sort of by the kind of the side of the pool that the creatures sort of kept in. And it moves quite quickly from that to kind of deep romantic love and sex. I mean, I know it's a film and it's not an enormous film and there's quite a lot of plot. They've got to get to the escape and then the attempt to recapture and then the finale. So, and all the other things that are going on around this. But I do feel that there was a bit where it's kind of oh, that happened quite quickly. They went from just I have affection to you, from I want to throw away my life to be with you.
Yeah, I think they're evoking the fairy tale rule a bit there. I think there's a degree of love at first sight or just magic destined love or something.
Yeah, and I guess you're right, and
also and just the rule of economy of what they can actually do. At the end of the day, it's a story in which all that can really happen is he can float in a couple of different tanks, and she can either sit or walk around nearby. I guess there are only so many lengthy scenes of that they could do, especially when they didn't have the option of dialogue, without it getting a bit samey.
And it's quite nice with the bit when she signs, he's the only one who doesn't see me as broken. That's kind of all you need. Right, okay, I get it now and stuff. And obviously, this is a film that is to a degree about films because so many of the characters are into films, and this is not the only film where this happens, where people meet, they kind of hang out a bit, and then they kind of jump to being in love.
Yep, no, I must admit, to be honest, when we saw this, I'm not sure I went into the film entirely in the mood for it, to be honest. I suspect if I'd hit the mood more perfectly, I might have felt the love a bit more. But it is a very sweet film. It's very hard not to get swept along in it to a fairly heavy extent.
Yeah, it's a very well made, well told and well acted sort of sweet story. And the period realization is beautiful, everything, the design and the music and the costuming. I think it's really just sumptuous to look at. It kind of reminded me a lot of the video game BioShock, set around the same time, and also with a kind of period setting, science fiction sort of thing underwater. The first trailer I saw for The Shape of Water, for the first few moments I thought, oh my god, they made a film of BioShock. Because it starts with this kind of sunken Art Deco sort of scene. Yeah, and it was beautiful. It's just one thing to leave me thinking is that, well, I wish they could make a film of BioShock. That'd be amazing. It probably would be quite similar to this, just less love, more horror.
I've only played BioShock once for about 5 minutes and it crashed my computer, so I enjoyed this more.
The Oscars are happening on the 4th of March. probably only a few days away when you listen to this episode. They're the biggest film awards of the year, and it's unusual that a science fiction film stands a chance of winning so many prizes. Has science fiction fantasy broken into the critical mainstream? Nick, when will Spider-Man finally win an Oscar?
Well, probably not this year, since Spider-Man Homecoming isn't nominated, although Spider-Man 2 did already win the Best Visual Effects Oscar, so they haven't at least got as far as the technical categories. Well, he, of course, Spider-Man, all three of the Spider-Men. Yeah, of course, although Spider-Man himself isn't quite there, we have got Logan in the screenplay category, which, is that the closest the superhero film has come to the big categories, outside of course, Heath Ledger's win for The Dark Knight, which was a slightly odd one, and I don't know. I don't want to say it doesn't count, because that feels like it's verging into speaking ill of the dead territory. I do struggle to believe it would entirely have happened if Heath Ledger hadn't very sadly died.
Yeah, it's one of the great counterfactuals of superhero film history, which is, would Heath Ledger Joker performance be viewed so positively if Heath Ledger hadn't died shortly thereafter? I think it's safe to say that he probably wouldn't have won.
I think it's such a big performance, it was such a huge film, he might have got nominated, and I'm not sure he'd have won. Yeah,
and also, if any superhero film was going to break the critical mainstream, it was clearly going to be the Christopher Nolan Batman adaptations, in that, Christopher Nolan's like a weighty director. I don't know, maybe if they get, Steven Spielberg to direct a superhero film at some point, it might win some Oscars. It really depends, but, I think there is a sort of seems to be a division in that, certain films are sort of considered blockbusters and certain films are considered, Oscarbait, as they're often described in a somewhat mocking way, in a sense that, these films are just like gunning for Oscars, it's a biography of Stephen Hawking and how he's tortured by illness, or it's, a film like The Shape of Water, which is a kind of pushing at genre boundaries and being sort of consciously a bit art house.
They have some Oscarbait points in their favour. It's not as if they're like franchise movies with moderate fantasy violence.
2 episodes in a row.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Shape of Water is, partly it's a touching piece about, sort of vaguely period piece about a load of overcoming their disability, shot with a lot of flair and with a slight edge of love letter to Hollywood.
Yeah, again, Hollywood loves films that lionize its own history, so this kind of is, you're playing to the gallows in... Is that the expression? No, it's not.
Playing to the gallows, lining up.
Playing to the gallery, that's the expression.
In the old days, they used to stick people's necks in the noose and then say, make us laugh or we'll fucking hang you.
Yeah.
Make us laugh or we'll hang you, the moderate fantasy violence story.
I thought that was what Twitter does now.
Yeah, that's pretty much. Well, make us laugh and then we'll hang you.
Yeah, also, there's that as well. One thing, to slightly deconstruct the question, as a lot of people who are fans of, independent films, art house films, what have you, do get kind of annoyed about how much the focus is on the Oscars. The majority of the year, cinema is dominated by, what's a commercial success. For one period of the year, everyone has to pretend that, no, this is actually a serious artistic medium and we're all about the self-expression. And obviously that period of the year is dominated by one very narrow type of film, which is usually either Hollywood films that are a little bit unusual, such as they're historic, or it's a biopic. This one, it doesn't have quite as many explosions. Or they're American independent films that are kind of on the slightly more mainstream side. And I don't think very, very unusual American independent films, like the work of Nicholas Safran Wilder. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, so apologies for messing it up. Those films that really do push at boundaries don't really get a look in. So there is a type of film that wins Oscars, and it's kind of annoying that they're the one films that get, Best Picture. It's not the best picture of the year, usually.
To be honest, it has a lot in common with what's seen as literary fiction in novels.
Yeah.
At least in England, they don't actually have that much of a handle on the American literary scene. But in Britain, there is a certain sense of there are these worthy novels, which are often historical pieces, or pieces about what it's like to live with a disability, or occasionally sort of slightly comic, but also ultimately always sad novels. And occasionally, novels with a hint of, fantasy elements, though it's usually played in a sort of magical realism way, in that, the fantasy thing is just kind of there. And you could argue that, I guess, The Shape of Water is, to an extent, that sort of literary magical realism. Yeah, no,
it's definitely on the, the borderline between fantasy and magical realism. But there's so many things about the kind of Oscar Best Picture that sort of, undermine the fact that it's clearly usually not the best film of the year. Foreign language films are their own category. The last foreign language film that was nominated for Best Picture, I think, was Amar, I can't remember how it's pronounced in English, which was, 5 or 6 years ago. Animation and documentaries are also separate categories. I don't think, often, a lot of the time, Pixar films can be like the best film of the year. They don't usually get a Best Picture nomination. It's not really representative of Hollywood or what the big Hollywood films are of the year. It's certainly not representative of the huge quantities of films that are, art house films, documentaries, foreign language films. And also sometimes they can be real sort of, fly-by-night films or films that kind of explode onto the scene and then fade really quickly. I mean, I was looking back at the list of previous Oscar winners of the last few years. So last year it was Moonlight, which was very good. Before that, the Best Picture, year before that, Spotlight, also good. Year before that, Birdman. I don't know if I could really argue that Birdman was the best film that came out in 2012, probably. That was.
Birdman was... no, probably not.
No, exactly. But one Best Picture. Yeah, and then looking back some winners like The King's Speech. The
King's Speech. I seem to remember The King's Speech being a bit of a sort of... I always got the sense that the King's Speech seemed to be the point where people really got to this sort of slightly frustrated sense of, Oscars give prize to obvious Oscarbait. Ooh.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was wondering if they had actually made an effort to try not to give it to, really obvious contenders since then. I don't know, Birdman, although it's arguably a bit not memorable and, as you say, possibly even just not good. At least it isn't, a really generic Oscar-bait, ponderous historical film.
No.
Not that that's a point in its favour, I'm just more sort of, it's just a point about with the Oscars, I don't know, whether there's been a vague sort of, oh god, are we just the pretentious historical film awards to really try and make an effort to seem relevant?
Yeah. No, I guess they did kind of mix it up a bit with that. Moonlight is quite an unusual film, actually, and is very good. It was won last year. But, Slumdog Millionaire... I mean, it was good, but it's fading. In 10, 20 years, it might be forgotten. The Departed, again, good film. I love Martin Scorsese, probably forgotten in 20 years. Crash isn't very good, and I've pretty much forgotten it already. And that one Best Picture. The Hurt Locker is amazing, but it's fading from popular consciousness.
Everything fades from popular consciousness, doesn't it? I mean...
Well, Star Wars doesn't, and it did win the Best Picture Oscar.
And, okay, a lot of these sort of films fade from popular consciousness, because, like it or not, the upside of being part of a franchise, and again, not really intended as a criticism, but, you get to stay in the consciousness, because every year or 2 or 3, someone puts out something else to remind you that it exists, and then everyone goes back and watches the old ones. Whereas, presumably there's not going to be Hurt Locker 2, Hurter Lockerer. So... There's
plenty of standalone films that have a huge impact in cinema, but never got a look in at the Best Picture. Easy Rider, The Graduate, Jaws. Obviously, there's enormous numbers of Jaws sequels, but the first one is the kind of the influential one. So there's been great films. Blade Runner, amazing, hugely important films, amazing films, but they never get a look in at the Oscars at the time because they're genre films or they're slightly unusual films, but not unusual in an Oscar-y way. And obviously, they're the films that people remember. So Driving Miss Daisy won Best Picture. Let's never forget that.
But this year, in terms of genre films, we have both Shape of Water and Get Out, which is, for all that it is also a social commentary film, it's definitely a very grindy, funny, messy horror film at its core.
Yeah, exactly. It's similar to The Shape of Water. It's a intelligent sort of art house film that's dressed up as a B movie to make a kind of commentary on B movies and society itself.
I don't know whether this is some sort of turning point, but I mean, I don't know whether this is just because of the sort of websites I frequent, but I've got the impression that not only have The Shape of Water and Get Out been nominated, but they're also among the favourites to do quite well. So, Is this a watershed in Spider-Man finally winning an Oscar? Have we finally reached a point where genre films can be accepted?
Yeah.
Or not?
Maybe. I'm getting quite animated about this, and I do realise that there is a degree to which this animation is possibly, shall we say, misplaced, in that, yes, there probably is a case that films, science fiction films, genre films, have been overlooked for Oscars. Films like Blade Runner is obviously an example, an amazing film, which didn't win Best Picture. I just looked it up, actually, and it was beaten to Best Picture by Gandhi, which is a good film, but I think Blade Runner is better.
Well, I don't know, I never feel quite right about commenting on the film scene years ago when I was either non-existent or barely conscious, because, I don't know what the scene was like at the time. God knows. There's probably plenty of films out now that may well go on to be more influential and important than Get Out or Shape of Water, but I just don't know what they are.
Yeah, but also it is unfortunate that sort of genre films and science fiction films and superhero films do kind of get overlooked for Oscars. But to be honest, it kind of pales in comparison to the fact that the majority of Oscar winners are white, usually Americans. And there is, even though obviously there's an equal number of male and female Oscar winners, but there is always an emphasis that the best actor is like, that's a more important Oscar than Best Actress. It's a sort of unspoken thing, and that's the one everyone's really excited about. So there is a sense of, like, with this sort of Oscars being against science fiction, like, this is the worst kind of prejudice. It's the prejudice that affects me as a straight white, cisgendered middle class man with a podcast. But no, the real The real stink is being like, Oscars So White, that was a couple of years ago when there were barely any people of colour nominated for Oscars. Or for the fact that I think there's only been one woman to win Best Director. I think that was for The Hurt Locker. If we're going to complain about Oscars, that's the real stinker.
I know some people thought Wonder Woman should have maybe got a nomination for a similar-ish reason, because it was a similar-ish reason to Get Out, I guess, in that it's just a big cultural moment. It's both a decent film and a cultural moment. I'm sort of prepared to accept that it didn't, because Get Out was not just a cultural moment. It's also, it also executes its genre fairly perfectly. It's a great horror film as well as a good bit of commentary. Whereas Wonder Woman definitely nailed its cultural moments, but as I said last week, the last 20 minutes were just gibberish. Sorry.
I think you're right. There may be a change. We're coming up to 20 years since X-Men came out. Superhero films are getting some more recognition. Like, say, Logan's got some nominations this year. And Logan, I think, was my favourite film of last year.
If any superhero film was going to break the Oscar hate superhero curse, it's probably going to be Logan. That very much had the sort of pretentious thoughtfulness you look for in your Oscar films. I'll be interested to see if Black Panther manages it next year, as that film is, probably as big or bigger a cultural thing than Wonder Woman, and it doesn't fall apart at the end anywhere near as badly. Yeah,
and it's very, very good. So I hope Black Panther gets some nominations next year. Yeah, but so maybe things are changing in terms of superhero films, that they are starting to break into the kind of the critical acceptance. And you've got films, you say, like Get Out or Shape of Water, that kind of play around with the concept of the B-movie. And they're both equally like B-movies and also, A-movies or Oscarbait films at the same time. So some of these, the silos have been broken down to a degree.
I think the Oscars clearly want to try and avoid just being completely siloed. Like, there's an extent to which they could just do nothing, keep doing what they've always done, and just become the shiny awards for films aimed at ageing cinephiles event. Yeah. And, no one would care. Cultural siloing would continue. Aging cinephiles would go and see those films, and the rest of us would ignore the whole thing. And they clearly don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
So that's why there's been an effort to actually, recognise things like Get Out, and, as you say, try and not to be quite as conspicuously only rewarding white people. And, as a result, to be fair to them for a few minutes, they still have a certain cachet as a result, but they have done a good job of keeping up. There are still people who want to see all the Best Picture nominations, or at least all the ones that they don't think look absolutely terrible. I'll be interested to see if they can keep it up, and if they do successfully become relevant again. But I think they are clearly trying to avoid it becoming the case that, a certain group of people go care about the Oscars and everyone else just increasingly just goes, who cares? Every website in the world, even us, the Modern Fantasy Violence podcast, has a best of year list. Could just read that.
Yeah.
That'll contain, stuff I care about, rather than the Oscars, which contain the stuff my dad cares about.
Yeah, which makes sense. And also, I think as more younger people, people who've sort of, grown up with, superhero films and genre films as a more staple part of their cinematic diet, as these people, join the Academy and get a say in how these things are done, things will sort of change over time as well. So, for example, I think Get Out has been nominated because of the push for diversity following Oscars So White. This is what we call progress.
I mean, yes, I think it's definitely, there must be some awareness that it's good for them to have it in there, but I'm not going to go as far as saying it's a token nomination. That film was massive as well. No one's questioning its right to be on the list.
I'm not saying it's a token nomination at all. I'm saying in the past, it would have been overlooked, and that would have been a crying shame, but the Academy has made some efforts to engage with the fact that, it is quite a white and male, straight and older institution. And, this is reflected in the films it nominates, and it will lose its legitimacy if it continues to miss some of the best films of the year, especially if it misses those films because they're made by or starring people who aren't white. So, yeah, they made an effort to diversify, and the nominees are diversifying, which is, as we think the point of this segment is that the diversification of Oscar nominations is a good thing.
Yes, I think we can all agree. When they finally give Spider-Man an Oscar, then they'll finally become relevant again.
Do I do some predictions of who's likely to win, so I can be really embarrassed in the next episode when they turn out to all be wrong?
I don't really know. I've seen other people's predictions, but I don't really have any strong insights. You can go if you want.
Okay, so this is my predictions. Send me beer if I'm right. Okay, so Best Picture winner, I'm going to say Shape of Water. Lead actor, I'm going to go for... That's a hard one, actually. No, lead actor, I'm going to go for Daniel Day-Lewis because he's retiring for Phantom Thread.
I know a lot of people think that Gary Oldman will get it. I kind of hope he doesn't, just because I find every time I see any material promoting Darkest Hour, I just shudder.
He won the BAFTA because we all love Churchill in Britain. I don't think he's going to win the Oscar. Lead actress, Sally Hawkins is amazing, but I think it'll go to Frances McDormand for 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Supporting actor... I think Sam Rockwell, again for 3 Billboards. Supporting actress, my money's on Alison Janney for I, Tonya. Best director, Guillermo del Toro's Shape of Water. Animated feature, I don't know. I'm going to skip over all the short films because I haven't seen any of them. Cinematographer, I'm going for Blade Runner.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm hoping Blade Runner wins that one, because even though I increasingly wonder how much that film would stand up to another viewing, it did look amazing.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen any of... Oh, foreign language film. No, I haven't seen any of them. The one I thought was going to win hasn't been nominated.
Cool.
Film editing, Baby Driver. Then we get into lots of technical stuff. Probably Shape of Water will do well where it's nominated for technical things. The only other prediction is Phantom Thread will win Best Costume Design because it's a film about costume design.
Yeah, I watched Movie Bob Chipman video on this, and his prediction was that out of Get Out and The Shape of Water, one of them will win Best Picture and the other will win Best Director. And he's not entirely sure which way it'll go. He thinks they'll nod towards Shape of Water over Get Out because they perhaps can't get over the feeling that Get Out, with all its discussion of white men who are just crazy about black culture, was sort of criticising them.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much a good summary of the situation.
Yeah.
Those are my predictions. Do get in contact on Twitter with either me or the MFV podcast feed, or Nick, to let us know what you think is likely to win. Tell Nick. Nick really wants to know.
Leave me alone. Okay, thank you for listening. That's all we've got for now. If you've enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more episodes, as well as articles and extra clips and stuff on our website at moderate-fantasyviolence.com. And also, if you particularly enjoyed it, feel free to go to iTunes, Stitcher, or any other pod website with a review section and leave a nice review. As we hear, it helps other people find the show.
You can also find us on all the good social media platforms. We're on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, or you can search for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can also search for Moderate Fantasy Violence on Facebook, and you'll see our purple logo, and you can follow us there. I've been Alistair Ball. You can follow me on Twitter at AlistairJRBall, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And I've been Nick Bryan. You can follow me on Twitter at NickMB, and I also have a website at nickbryan.com, which has information on my crime books and some comics I've been slowly but surely writing and having drawn. And yep, that is all for now. We'll be back in 2 weeks when, for the first time in a while, we'll be going back and catching up on a TV show, specifically Star Trek Discovery. See you then for that. Bye-bye.
Bye. Certainly, the Academy is making an effort to be more diverse racially and in other and with
sexually.
Sexuality, I was trying to say, but
sexuality. In terms of sexuality.
Yeah, exactly. As a middle-class English person, words with sex in them always stick in my throat. In the sense of, this is vaguely public, and I'm going to talk about sex.